The council chamber was filled with the sounds of alien voices, all speaking at once in languages that humans could never pronounce without technology. War Master Thrakvan sat in his massive throne, his forearms crossed in a gesture that showed complete disrespect. He was looking at a holographic image of Earth floating in the center of the room, and he was laughing. The Kralix Empire had conquered 40 systems in the last 100 years. Thrakvan had personally led the fleets that crushed 20 different civilizations. Some of those civilizations had technology far more advanced than the primitive humans. Some had populations in the trillions. None of them had survived more than a month against the Kralix military machine. Earth would fall even faster, he was certain of that. Beside him, Supreme Tactician Velmora glowed with soft blue light. Her species communicated partly through bioluminescence, and right now her light patterns were showing pure amusement. She had studied the humans for 3 months, watching their military movements, analyzing their defensive capabilities, and she had concluded that they were no threat at all. The Sindari Collective had destroyed civilizations that were 100 times more dangerous than Earth. A third leader sat at the council table, quieter than the others, but no less powerful. Prime Commander Krell of the Zorvath Dominion had brought his fleet to join the invasion force, though he seemed less enthusiastic about it than his allies. Krell had a reputation for being careful and methodical, which other species sometimes mistook for weakness. The Zorvath had conquered fewer worlds than the Kralix or Sindari, but they had never lost a single battle in their 200-year military history. The holographic display changed to show Earth's defensive fleet. 32 ships. That was all humanity had managed to build in their brief time as a spacefaring species. The council members looked at those 32 ships and saw nothing worth their concern. The combined invasion force numbered over 3,000 vessels, each one more powerful than anything Earth had ever constructed. Thrakvan spoke in his native language, and the translation computers turned his words into something humans could understand. His message was being broadcast to Earth as a formal declaration of war, though in his mind it was more like a statement of inevitable fact. He told the humans they had 3 days to surrender completely. They would become a subject species of the Galactic Council. Their planet would be strip-mined for resources. Their people would serve as labor for the great empires. This was the way of the galaxy, he explained. The strong conquered the weak, and humanity was very weak indeed. Far below the council chamber, on a small orbital station circling Earth, Captain Jake Morrison read the translated message with a calm expression that his crew found unsettling. They knew their captain well enough to understand that when he looked calm, it meant he was thinking dangerous thoughts. Jake had served in Earth's military for 20 years before humanity even had a space force. He had studied every major war in human history, from ancient battles fought with swords and spears to modern conflicts fought with drones and cyber weapons. He understood something that the Galactic Council had completely missed. Lieutenant Lisa Hayes sat at the communications station, monitoring the alien broadcasts. She had been listening to the Kralix fleet's internal communications for weeks now, and she had learned something interesting. The aliens were incredibly arrogant. They spent more time arguing about who would get credit for conquering Earth than they spent planning the actual invasion. They assumed the battle was already won before it had even started. Commander Danny Price was working at the tactical station, updating the defensive positions of Earth's small fleet. He looked up at Jake and asked the question that everyone on the station was thinking. Did they actually have a chance against an enemy that outnumbered them 100 to 1? Jake smiled and said yes, but not by fighting the way the aliens expected them to fight. The problem with the Galactic Council, Jake explained to his senior staff, was that they had been winning for too long. They had conquered so many civilizations that they had forgotten how to adapt to new situations. They had a playbook, a standard set of tactics that worked against every enemy they had ever faced. They would send in their massive fleet, destroy the defensive forces in a straightforward battle, and then occupy the planet. It was efficient, it was overwhelming, and it had never failed them. But Jake had studied human history, and he knew something the aliens didn't know. Every empire that had ever existed on Earth eventually fell, and they almost always fell in the same way. They grew overconfident. They stopped adapting. They assumed that the tactics that had worked in the past would continue to work in the future, and then some smaller, weaker, more desperate enemy found a way to exploit that overconfidence and brought the empire crashing down. Jake pulled up a file on his computer and showed it to his staff. It was a collection of human military strategies from throughout history: guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, deception tactics, asymmetric warfare, hit-and-run attacks, false intelligence, propaganda. Humanity had spent thousands of years fighting wars against enemies that had more soldiers, better weapons, and stronger positions. Humans had learned how to win anyway, not through brute force but through creativity and adaptation. The Galactic Council had studied human military history too, but they had only looked at the big battles and conventional wars. They had analyzed human tank formations and aircraft carriers and missile systems. They thought they understood how humans fought. What they had missed were all the unconventional tactics, all the times humans had won by refusing to play by the expected rules. Jake opened a communication channel to all 32 ships in Earth's defensive fleet. He gave them their orders in simple, clear language. They were not going to win this war by fighting fair. They were going to win by making the aliens fight themselves. The ships acknowledged his orders and moved into position. On the civilian side of the operation, Captain Susan Martinez was preparing her freighter for departure. The ship was called Liberty's Hope, and it was officially registered as a supply vessel carrying food and medical equipment to the outer colonies. The Galactic Council's sensors would scan the ship and see exactly what they expected to see: a harmless civilian freighter going about its normal business. What the sensors would not detect was the special cargo hidden in the ship's secondary holds, cargo that would change everything once it was deployed. Susan had been a military pilot before she became a freighter captain, and she understood the mission perfectly. She was not worried about the alien fleet. She was not even worried about the 3,000-to-1 odds. She had learned a long time ago that wars were not won by the side with the most ships. Wars were won by the side that best understood psychology, logistics, and the art of making your enemy defeat themselves. Back in the council chamber, Thrukvan was giving his final orders to the fleet commanders. They would attack at dawn Earth time in exactly 48 hours. The humans would see their fleet approaching and would realize the futility of resistance. Most of them would probably surrender without a fight. The ones who did fight would be crushed quickly and efficiently. By sunset on that day, Earth would belong to the Galactic Council. Villamora agreed with every word. Her bioluminescence glowed bright with confidence. Krell said nothing, but he looked thoughtful. He had read more of the human history files than the others, and something about humanity's past troubled him. They had a pattern of losing battles but winning wars. They had a tendency to do the unexpected. They seemed to thrive in situations where they were outnumbered and outgunned, but Krell kept his concerns to himself. He was one voice among many, and the others were all certain of victory. Perhaps he was worrying about nothing. Perhaps the humans would indeed fall as easily as everyone expected. He ordered his ships to prepare for the attack and tried to ignore the small feeling of doubt in his mind. Jake Morrison looked at the countdown timer on his display. 48 hours until the aliens attacked. 48 hours to make sure every piece of his plan was in position. He was not worried about the odds. He was not concerned about the enemy's superior technology. He had something much more valuable than numbers or weapons. He had thousands of years of human experience in fighting impossible wars and finding ways to win them anyway. The War Master of the Kralix Empire went to sleep that night, confident in his inevitable victory. Captain Jake Morrison did not sleep at all. He spent the night making final preparations, checking contingencies, and making sure that every element of Operation Jester was ready to launch. The aliens thought they were about to conquer Earth. They had no idea they were about to learn the most important lesson in military history. Never underestimate an enemy just because they are smaller, weaker, or less advanced than you, because sometimes the weak win not by becoming strong but by making the strong destroy themselves. The alien fleet arrived exactly when Thrukvan had promised, coming out of warp space at dawn over the European sector of Earth. 3,000 warships filled the sky like a swarm of metal locusts, their weapons powered up and ready to fire. The formation was perfect, textbook military strategy that had worked on every world the Galactic Council had ever conquered. Massive dreadnoughts formed the center, cruisers protected the flanks, and fighter craft spread out in defensive screens. It looked unstoppable because it had never been stopped before. Commander Kate Sullivan stood on the bridge of her destroyer, watching the enemy fleet approach through her view screen. She had been in Earth's Navy for 15 years, and she had seen some impressive military displays during that time. But nothing compared to the sight of 3,000 alien warships moving in perfect synchronization. It should have been terrifying, and for most of her crew it probably was, but Kate found herself smiling. The aliens were so confident, so perfectly organized, so completely predictable. Her tactical officer spoke quietly, reminding her that they were outnumbered more than 90-1. Kate nodded and said something that would have sounded insane to anyone who didn't know the plan. She said the aliens had already lost, they just didn't know it yet. The tactical officer looked confused but trusted his commander enough to stay silent. Back on the orbital station, Jake Morrison watched the same scene unfold on his displays. He had 17 different screens showing him data from sensors, communications intercepts, and visual feeds from various ships. He saw the alien fleet moving into attack formation, saw them powering up their weapons, saw them preparing for what they thought would be a quick and easy victory. Everything was going exactly according to plan, which meant it was time to spring the trap. Jake opened a channel to all human ships and gave a single-word command. The word was run. Immediately, all 32 ships of Earth's defensive fleet turned and began moving away from the alien armada. They didn't scatter randomly or flee in panic. They moved in a coordinated retreat, staying in formation but clearly withdrawing from the battle. To the aliens, it looked like exactly what they expected to see, the humans realizing they were beaten and trying to escape. On the bridge of his flagship, Throckvan saw the human ships running and felt a surge of satisfaction. This was how it always ended. The inferior species saw the might of the Galactic Council and understood that resistance was futile. He ordered his entire fleet to pursue, not wanting to let a single human vessel escape. The War Master wanted a complete victory, total annihilation of Earth's military capacity. His ships surged forward, breaking from their careful formation in their eagerness to catch the fleeing humans. Velmora's fleet followed close behind, her bioluminescence flashing with excitement. This was the moment she loved most in any conquest, the moment when the enemy broke and ran. She had seen it dozens of times before, and it never got old. Her ships accelerated, pushing their engines hard to catch up with the human vessels. She didn't notice that the humans were leading them deeper into Earth's orbital space, pulling them away from their safe positions and into a more confined area filled with asteroids and debris. Krell watched the pursuit with growing unease. His species was not as quick to chase glory as the Kralix or Sindari. He had learned over many years that an enemy running away was not always an enemy defeated. Sometimes retreat was a tactic, a way to pull the attacker into a disadvantageous position. He ordered his ships to maintain their formation and advance carefully, but his caution was drowned out by the enthusiasm of his allies. The Kralix and Sindari fleets were already far ahead, completely focused on catching the humans. That was when Susan Martinez, sitting in the captain's chair of her freighter in the asteroid belt, received the signal she had been waiting for. She pressed a single button on her console, and 17 other freighters scattered throughout the area did the same. Suddenly, the space around the alien fleet erupted with targets. Thousands of them appeared on sensors, each one registering as a solid contact with mass, heat signatures, and energy readings. The careful pursuit turned into chaos in an instant. The technology was not complicated, at least not by the standards of species that could travel faster than light. Holographic projectors had been used on Earth for decades, mainly for entertainment and advertising. But humanity had found a military application that the Galactic Council had never considered. The projectors created images that looked completely real to sensors. They generated fake heat signatures, false mass readings, and artificial energy patterns. To the alien ships, it appeared that Earth suddenly had 10,000 vessels instead of 32. Throckvan stared at his tactical display in complete confusion. Where there had been 32 human ships a moment ago, there were now thousands. His sensors were going crazy, trying to track every contact and failing. His weapons officers were asking which targets to engage. His helmsman was trying to avoid collisions with what appeared to be enemy ships on every side. The perfect military. Formation dissolved into chaos as each ship tried independently to deal with the suddenly overwhelming number of targets. Ships began firing at the holographic projections, wasting ammunition on targets that didn't exist. Other ships maneuvered to avoid collisions with phantoms, putting themselves in the path of their own allies. 2 Kralix cruisers collided with each other while trying to evade what their sensors told them were incoming human destroyers. A Sindari battleship fired its main cannon at a target that turned out to be another Sindari battleship on the other side of the hologram. Within 10 minutes, the alien fleet had lost more ships to friendly fire and accidents than they had lost to actual human weapons. Lieutenant Lisa Hayes was monitoring the alien communications from her station, and what she heard was almost funny. The Kralix captains were shouting at each other, accusing each other of cowardice or incompetence. The Sindari were trying to reorganize but couldn't figure out which ships were real and which were illusions. Some captains were convinced they were surrounded. Others thought they were being attacked from inside their own formation. A few had even concluded that some kind of virus had infected their sensor systems and were shutting down their equipment, leaving themselves blind and helpless. The real human ships used the confusion perfectly. They would appear from behind a cloud of holographic vessels, fire a quick volley at a real target, and then disappear back into the swarm of phantoms before the aliens could coordinate a response. It was like fighting shadows, except the shadows occasionally hit back. Every few minutes, another alien ship would explode or suffer critical damage, and the surviving vessels had no idea where the attack had come from. Jake had studied this kind of warfare in Earth's military history. It was called asymmetric tactics, fighting in a way that negated the enemy's advantages and exploited their weaknesses. The Galactic Council had overwhelming firepower and numbers, but those advantages only worked if they could see their enemy clearly and coordinate their forces effectively. Take away their ability to distinguish real from fake, and suddenly their 3,000 ships became a liability rather than an asset. They were bumping into each other, shooting at each other, and generally doing Jake's job for him. Danny Price pulled up a damage assessment after the first hour of battle. The alien fleet had lost 41 ships completely destroyed and over 100 damaged. Earth's fleet had lost exactly 0 ships, though a few had minor damage from near misses. The mathematics of the battle had reversed. Instead of the aliens having a 100-to-1 advantage, they had effectively become their own worst enemy. But Jake wasn't satisfied with just confusing them. He had another layer to the plan, something that would hit them where they were even more vulnerable than their sensor systems. He gave another order, and suddenly every communication frequency used by the Galactic Council filled with emergency messages. Distress calls from Kralix homeworlds, panic transmissions from Sindari colonies, reports of human fleets attacking deep in Council territory, thousands of light years from Earth. The messages were fake, of course. Every human ship was right here, creating beautiful chaos in Earth orbit. But the aliens didn't know that. To them, it appeared that humanity had somehow launched a massive counteroffensive across dozens of star systems simultaneously. It was impossible, but their sensors were telling them it was happening. After an hour of fighting phantoms and shooting at shadows, the alien commanders were no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. Bellamora received a message claiming her homeworld was under siege, and her confident glow dimmed to almost nothing. She wanted to believe it was another human trick, but after everything else that had happened, how could she be certain? Throkvan was screaming orders to his fleet, trying to restore order, but half his captains were demanding permission to return home to defend their families. The unified invasion force was tearing itself apart from the inside. Only Krell maintained his composure. He studied the situation carefully and came to the correct conclusion. The attacks on their home systems were fabrications, just like the phantom ships filling the space around them. The humans were using psychological warfare, making the aliens defeat themselves through fear and confusion. It was brilliant and it was working perfectly. Krell ordered his ships to stand down and wait, refusing to chase phantoms or believe false reports. But his caution came too late. The damage was done. After 16 hours of fighting shadows and panicking about fake threats, Throkvan finally gave the order to retreat. The mighty Galactic Council fleet, which had expected to conquer Earth in a single day, turned and fled. They left behind the wreckage of 43 ships, all destroyed by friendly fire or accidents, and took with them the knowledge that they had been thoroughly humiliated by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive and harmless. Jake Morrison watched them go and allowed himself a small smile. Round 1 was over, and humanity hadn't even needed to land a real punch. The council chamber felt different now, heavy with anger and shame instead of confidence and laughter. Throck Von paced back and forth on his forelegs, his forearms clenching and unclenching in a way that showed barely controlled rage. He had returned from Earth with his fleet in tatters, not from human weapons but from his own forces shooting at each other in confusion. The other members of the Kralix Empire were already whispering that he had brought disgrace upon their entire civilization. Bellamora sat in her chair with her bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing, which in her species was a sign of deep shame. She had lost ships too, and worse, she had panicked when the false messages about her home world came through. She had nearly broken formation to rush back to defend a planet that was never actually under attack. Her people valued calm tactical thinking above all else, and she had shown neither calm nor tactical sense in the battle. The Sindari Collective was questioning whether she should remain a supreme tactician. Krell stood quietly near the window, looking out at the stars. His fleet had suffered the least damage because he had recognized the human tactics for what they were, and had ordered his ships to stay calm and organized, but even he felt the sting of defeat. The Zorvath Dominion had never lost a battle in 200 years, and while they had not technically lost this one either, they had certainly not won. Retreating from an enemy you outnumbered 100 to 1 was not something any military commander wanted on their record. The three leaders finally stopped their individual brooding and faced each other across the holographic table. Throckvan spoke first, his voice rough with anger. He said they needed to attack again immediately, with even more ships, and this time they would not fall for human tricks. They would use better sensors, maintain strict discipline, and ignore any distractions. The humans had caught them by surprise once, but it would not happen again. Velmora agreed, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She said her people demanded revenge for the humiliation. The Sindari had conquered 47 civilizations, and they could not allow their reputation to be damaged by a species that had barely left their own solar system. They needed to show the galaxy that the defeat at Earth was a fluke, an accident that would be corrected with overwhelming force. Krell listened to both of them and then spoke in his usual measured tone. He said they were both making the same mistake they had made before. They were letting their emotions control their strategy. The humans had not defeated them with superior weapons or tactics. The humans had defeated them by understanding psychology better than they did. Every move the humans made was designed to make the aliens react emotionally rather than logically. And it had worked perfectly. Throckvan snarled at Krell, asking if he was suggesting they should simply give up and let the humans go unpunished. Krell replied calmly that he was suggesting they should study their enemy before attacking again. The humans clearly knew something about warfare that the Galactic Council had forgotten or never learned. Rushing back into battle while angry and humiliated was exactly what the humans would expect them to do, which meant it was probably exactly what they should not do. But Throckvan and Velmora were not interested in patience or study. They were interested in restoring their honor and proving their strength. Within 3 weeks, they had assembled an even larger fleet of 5,000 ships. This time, they installed new sensor systems designed to detect holographic projections. They created strict communication protocols to prevent false messages from causing panic. They drilled their crews on maintaining formation no matter what tricks the enemy tried. They were certain that this time they would crush the humans completely. While the Galactic Council prepared for their second attack, Jake Morrison was preparing something entirely different. He sat in a small room with a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Matt Cooper, reviewing files on every species that the Council had conquered in the last century. Matt had spent months compiling this information, and what he had found was both disturbing and useful. The Kralix, Sindari, and Zorvath had built their empires by conquering weaker species and forcing them into servitude. Those conquered species were not treated as equals or even as valued subjects. They were treated as resources to be exploited. Jake looked at the list of subjugated species and saw opportunity. 23 different civilizations were currently living under Galactic Council rule, many of them for decades. Some had tried to rebel and been crushed. Others had given up hope of ever being free. But all of them, Jake suspected, would be very interested in learning that their oppressors had just been humiliated by a species they had dismissed as primitive. Matt explained his research findings. Most of the conquered species had their own military traditions, their own ideas about warfare and strategy, but the Galactic Council had suppressed all of that, forcing everyone to fight using Council-approved tactics and methods. It was part of how they maintained control. If every species fought the same way, it was easier to predict and counter any rebellion. But it also meant that none of these species had been exposed to the kind of unconventional thinking that humans specialized in. Jake asked Matt a simple question. What would happen if they shared Earth's military knowledge with these conquered species? What if they taught them the tactics that had just defeated 3 major empires? Matt smiled and said it would probably cause the biggest wave of rebellions the galaxy had ever seen. Jake smiled back and said that was exactly the point. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Earth would make contact with representatives of the conquered species secretly. They would share their historical military databases, their tactics manuals, their guerrilla warfare handbooks. They would teach these species how to fight asymmetrically, how to use deception, how to make an occupying force defeat itself through its own overconfidence, and they would coordinate the timing so that all these rebellions happened simultaneously, right when the Galactic Council was most distracted by their war with Earth. Matt began making the contacts quietly through encrypted channels. The first species he reached out to was the Talvan people, a civilization that had been under Kralek's rule for 40 years. The Talvan had tried to rebel twice before and had been brutally suppressed both times. They were suspicious when a human contacted them offering help, but they were also desperate enough to listen. Matt showed them Earth's history of successful rebellions and resistance movements. He showed them how smaller forces had defeated larger ones throughout human history by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. He explained guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage, propaganda, and psychological operations. The Talvan representative listened with growing interest. These were tactics their people had never considered because the Galactic Council had taught them that there was only one proper way to conduct warfare. The meetings with other species followed a similar pattern. The Soraks, the Mindari, the Pelthon, each one listening to human ideas about warfare that seemed completely foreign to them but also strangely logical. Why fight the enemy where they were strongest? Why not attack their supply lines, their communication networks, their ability to coordinate? Why not make the occupying forces so paranoid and confused that they made mistakes? Matt also shared something else with these species, something that proved to be even more powerful than tactical advice. He shared Earth's history of successful resistance movements that had overthrown empires. He showed them recordings of humans talking about freedom, about the right to determine their own destiny, about how no amount of military force could permanently suppress a people who refused to give up. It was propaganda, but it was also true, and it resonated with species who had been living under oppression for decades. Back on Earth, preparations were being made for the next phase. Kate Sullivan was training her crew on new tactics for when the aliens returned. Susan Martinez was positioning more equipment throughout the solar system for the next round of deception. Danny Price was analyzing the sensor data from the first battle, looking for patterns in how the aliens had reacted. Everyone knew the Galactic Council would come back, probably soon and probably with even more ships. Lisa Hayes brought Jake some intercepted communications from the Kralek's fleet. They were planning their next attack and seemed confident that their new sensors and protocols would prevent another disaster. Jake read the intelligence reports and nodded. Good. Let them feel confident. Confidence led to predictable behavior, and predictable behavior led to defeat. The aliens were so focused on countering what Earth had done in the first battle that they were not thinking about what Earth might do differently in the second one. Jake opened a channel to Matt Cooper, who was now operating deep in Galactic Council territory, coordinating with the various resistance groups. He asked if the rebel forces were ready. Matt confirmed that 23 different species had agreed to participate, and they were just waiting for the signal. When the Galactic Council launched their next attack on Earth, that would be the moment. While the Council's military forces were distracted and their home systems were less defended, the rebellions would begin. It was a strategy that humans had used before in their own history. During various wars on Earth, resistance movements had waited for the perfect moment when the occupying forces were weakened or distracted, and then they had struck. The Galactic Council had never faced this kind of coordinated uprising before, because they had never fought an enemy that understood how to organize one. They were about to learn that conquering a planet was easy. Holding it was much harder. especially when your subjects suddenly had access to thousands of years of human experience in revolutionary warfare. Jake looked at the countdown timer showing when the alien fleet would likely arrive for their second attack. 72 hours. In that time, the largest coordinated rebellion in galactic history would be set in motion. The Galactic Council thought they were coming back to Earth to finish what they started. They had no idea they were about to lose their empires. The second attack came exactly when Jake Morrison predicted it would, with 5,000 alien ships dropping out of warp space in perfect formation. This time, the Galactic Council fleet was disciplined and organized. Every ship maintained its position. Every commander had strict orders to verify targets before firing. Every sensor system had been upgraded to detect holographic projections. Throckvon was determined that the humans would not embarrass him twice. Kate Sullivan watched the massive fleet approach and had to admit they had learned something from the first battle. The formation was tighter, the communication discipline was better, and the ships were not chasing after the human fleet with wild enthusiasm. They were advancing slowly and carefully, which meant they were thinking instead of just reacting. That was unfortunate for humanity, but also expected. No enemy stayed stupid forever, and the Galactic Council had plenty of resources to adapt their tactics. The human fleet moved to intercept, but this time they did not run away. Jake had decided that repeating the same trick twice would be predictable, and predictability was dangerous. Instead, the 32 human ships simply held their position and broadcast a message on all frequencies. It was a documentary about ancient Earth history, specifically about something called the Trojan War. The film showed how a city called Troy had held out against attackers for years until the attackers used deception to sneak soldiers inside a giant wooden horse. Velmora watched the documentary with confusion. Why were the humans showing them a history lesson in the middle of a battle? It made no sense tactically. She assumed it was another psychological trick, but she could not figure out what the trick was supposed to accomplish. The story was interesting in an academic way, but it did not seem relevant to the current situation. She ordered her fleet to continue advancing and to ignore the strange broadcast. Throckvon was equally confused but also suspicious. The humans had proven they were masters of deception and misdirection. If they were broadcasting this story, there had to be a reason. He ordered his intelligence officers to analyze the documentary for hidden messages or codes. They found nothing. It was simply a historical film about an ancient war on Earth. The War Master decided the humans were trying to distract them and ordered all ships to focus on the actual battle. Krell watched the documentary with more interest than his allies. He had studied human history more carefully than the others, and he recognized the story. The Trojan horse was one of the most famous deceptions in human military history. But why show it now? The humans could not possibly sneak a wooden horse into space, unless the documentary was not meant for the Galactic Council at all. Unless it was meant for someone else entirely. While the alien fleet advanced on Earth and its commanders puzzled over the strange broadcast, something else was happening across Galactic Council territory. On a planet called Talvin Prime, deep in Kralik space, a rebellion erupted with sudden violence. Weapons that had been hidden for years suddenly appeared in the hands of people who were supposed to be subjugated and helpless. Talvin fighters struck at Kralik's military installations, communication centers, and supply depots. They used tactics that looked nothing like traditional Talvin warfare, and everything like human guerrilla tactics. On another world, the Sorex people rose up against their Sindari occupiers. They did not try to fight the Sindari fleet in open battle, which would have been suicide. Instead, they sabotaged the infrastructure that the Sindari depended on. Power plants went offline. Food shipments were redirected. Communication networks crashed. The Sindari garrison found itself cut off, confused, and unable to coordinate an effective response. One by one, across 23 different star systems, the conquered species of the Galactic Council began their rebellions. Each uprising was coordinated to begin at exactly the same moment, ensuring that the Council's forces were overwhelmed and unable to reinforce each other. And each rebellion used tactics that were completely unfamiliar to the Council's military commanders but would have been instantly recognizable to any student of human history. Matt Cooper watched the rebellions begin from his position on a neutral trading station. He had spent weeks teaching these species how to fight asymmetrically, how to strike where the enemy was weak, how to avoid direct confrontation while still inflicting maximum damage. Now he was watching his students put those lessons into practice, and they were doing remarkably well. The Galactic Council had no experience dealing with this kind of warfare, because they had spent centuries forcing everyone to fight the same way. Back in Earth's orbit, the alien fleet was still advancing when Throckvan received the first report of rebellion. His communications officer informed him that Talvin Prime was under attack by rebel forces. The War Master dismissed it as a minor uprising that local forces could handle. Then came a second report about the Sorex rebellion, then a third about the Mindari. Then reports started flooding in faster than the communications officer could relay them. Velmora's bioluminescence flared in panic when she received word that 3 of her colony worlds were in full revolt. The Sindari had always maintained control through military presence, but most of their military was here, attacking Earth. The colonies were defended by skeleton crews that were never meant to handle serious resistance. She turned to her tactical officers and demanded to know how this was possible. How had so many species coordinated simultaneous rebellions across such vast distances? Krell already knew the answer. He looked at the documentary about the Trojan horse that was still playing on all frequencies and understood the message. The humans had not been trying to trick the Galactic Council with the broadcast. They had been sending a signal to every conquered species in Council space. The message was simple. Your oppressors are distracted, and this is your chance. The documentary was not about a wooden horse. It was about using deception and timing to defeat a stronger enemy. It was a call to arms. The Galactic Council fleet hung in space, paralyzed by indecision. Every commander was receiving urgent messages from their home territories, begging for reinforcements. Colony governors were reporting that they were losing control. Military bases were being overrun. Infrastructure was being destroyed. The carefully constructed empires that the Council had built over centuries were crumbling in a matter of hours. Admiral Tony Blake, now commanding the human fleet directly, opened a communication channel to the entire alien armada. His voice was calm and almost friendly. He explained that the Galactic Council was now learning an important lesson about conquest. Every species they had subjugated had become a potential enemy. Every world they occupied required military force to maintain control. And when that military force was elsewhere, those conquered peoples tended to remember that they preferred freedom over servitude. Throckvan listened to the human admiral and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Fear, not fear of the human fleet in front of him, but fear of what was happening to his empire. The Kralix had conquered 40 star systems, and if even half of them were in rebellion, his entire civilization could collapse. The military strength that made conquest possible also made the empire vulnerable. Too many ships in one place meant too few ships everywhere else. Velmora was facing the same calculation. She could continue the attack on Earth and possibly win, but at what cost? If she lost her colony worlds, if her subject species all achieved independence, the Sindari Collective would be reduced to a shadow of its former power. The price of defeating Earth might be the destruction of everything her people had built. Only Krell seemed calm, but his calmness came from resignation rather than confidence. He had warned his colleagues that the humans were dangerous, not because of their weapons, but because of their understanding of warfare. Now that warning had come true in the worst possible way. The Zorvath Dominion was experiencing rebellions too, though fewer than the Kralix or Sindari because Krell had treated his subject species somewhat better. But even he could not afford to stay at Earth while his territory burned. Jake Morrison watched the alien fleet from his command station and saw exactly what he had hoped to see. Confusion, panic, ships beginning to break formation as individual commanders made their own decisions about whether to continue the attack or return home. The careful discipline that the Council had maintained for the first hour of battle was evaporating as the reality of their situation became clear. Admiral Blake sent another message to the alien fleet. He pointed out that even if they destroyed every human ship and conquered Earth, it would not help them. The rebellions were not dependent on Earth's survival. Matt Cooper and dozens of other human intelligence officers had already taught the conquered species everything they needed to know. The knowledge could not be unlearned, and the desire for freedom could not be suppressed by military force alone. Kate Sullivan watched as the first alien ships began turning away from Earth. Then more followed. Within an hour, Entire squadrons were breaking off to return to their home territories. Thrukvan tried to maintain order, screaming commands over the communication networks, but his authority had evaporated. His captains were more worried about their families and their home worlds than they were about following orders. Velimora made the decision before Thrukvan did. She ordered her entire fleet to withdraw and return to Sindari space. Her bioluminescence was dim with shame. But shame was better than watching her civilization collapse. The Sindari collective could survive losing a war with Earth. It might not survive losing control of its conquered territories. Finally, Thrukvan gave the order to retreat. The mighty Galactic Council fleet, larger and better prepared than the first attack, turned and fled without firing a shot. They had been defeated not by human weapons but by human ideas, the knowledge of how to fight unconventionally, how to organize resistance, how to time rebellions for maximum effect. Those ideas were now spreading across the galaxy like fire. Jake allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before returning to work. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Galactic Council would need to deal with their rebellions before they could threaten Earth again. That would buy humanity time, possibly years to prepare for whatever came next. And in that time, the galaxy would learn that humans were not just good at fighting wars. They were excellent at teaching others how to fight for themselves. 6 months passed after the second battle, and the galaxy looked completely different than it had before. The Kralix Empire no longer existed as a unified force. What remained had split into 17 different factions, each claiming to be the legitimate government while simultaneously trying to suppress rebellions in their own territories. Most of the species that had been conquered by the Kralix were now independent, forming their own governments and making their own decisions for the first time in decades. The Sindari collective had suffered even worse losses. Velimora had been removed from her position as supreme tactician and exiled to a remote colony world. The Sindari had lost more than half their territory to independence movements, and the remaining colonies were only staying loyal because the Sindari had finally started treating them as partners instead of subjects. It was a lesson learned too late, and at terrible cost. Only the Zorvath Dominion had survived relatively intact, and that was because Krell had done something that shocked the entire galaxy. He had negotiated with his subject species. He had offered them autonomy and representation in exchange for maintaining their alliance with the Zorvath. Some species had accepted the deal. Others had chosen full independence. But unlike the Kralix and Sindari, the Zorvath had managed the transition without complete collapse. The new Galactic Assembly met in a space station that had been built specifically for this purpose. It was neutral territory, not owned by any single species but jointly administered by all member nations. Representatives from 63 different species gathered in the main chamber, and for the first time in galactic history, they gathered as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered. Jake Morrison stood in the assembly chamber wearing a formal uniform that felt uncomfortable after months of military operations. He had been chosen to represent Earth at this historic meeting, not because he was a diplomat, but because he was the person who had started the whole chain of events that led to this moment. President Lisa Chen had decided that the man who defeated 3 empires should be the one to speak for humanity, as the galaxy tried to figure out what came next. Ambassador Thala of the Talvin people approached Jake with what her species used as a smile. She thanked him for what humanity had done for her people. The Talvin were free for the first time in 40 years, and they would never forget that it was human knowledge and human tactics that made that freedom possible. Jake accepted her thanks, but pointed out that the Talvin had freed themselves. Humans had just shared some ideas. The courage and the fighting had come from the Talvin people themselves. Thrukvan was also present at the assembly, though he no longer held any official title or authority. His people had stripped him of his rank and his position after the disasters at Earth. He approached Jake slowly, his forearms hanging loose in a gesture that indicated submission or respect. The former War Master said he needed to understand something. How had humans known that the Galactic Council's empires were so fragile? What had given humanity the insight to strike at that particular weakness? Jake considered his answer carefully before speaking. He explained that Earth's history was filled with empires that seemed invincible until suddenly they were not. Rome had controlled most of Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries before collapsing. The Mongol Empire had conquered more territory than any other in human history, before fragmenting. The British Empire had controlled a quarter of the world before losing it all in a few decades. Humans had seen this pattern repeat over and over throughout their history. Every empire, Jake continued, made the same fundamental mistake. They grew by conquering others, and they maintained control through military force and intimidation. But military force could not be everywhere at once. Intimidation only worked as long as people believed the empire was invincible. The moment that belief cracked, the moment the conquered people saw weakness or opportunity, the whole structure became unstable. The Galactic Council had built their empires on the same flawed foundation that had doomed every empire in human history. Thrakvan listened in silence, and then asked another question. Why had humans shared their knowledge so freely? They could have used their advantage to build their own empire, to conquer while the Council was weakened and distracted. Instead, they had given away the very tactics that made them dangerous. Jake smiled and said that was exactly the point. Empires always failed eventually. Humans did not want to build something that was destined to collapse. They wanted to build something that could last. Krell joined the conversation, his expression thoughtful. He said he had studied human history more carefully than the others, and he had found the pattern that Jake described. But he had also found something else. Human history was not just about empires rising and falling. It was also about humans learning from their mistakes. Every time an empire collapsed, the next civilization tried to build something better. Democracy instead of monarchy. Republics instead of dictatorships. Cooperation instead of conquest. Humanity had spent thousands of years experimenting with different forms of government and social organization. Jake nodded and said that was the real lesson Earth wanted to share with the galaxy. Not just how to defeat empires, but how to build something better than empire. The Galactic Assembly was humanity's proposal for what should replace the old system. Instead of a few powerful species dominating everyone else, every species would have a voice and a vote. Instead of conquest and subjugation, there would be cooperation and mutual benefit. Instead of military force holding everything together, there would be shared interests and voluntary alliance. Admiral Tony Blake addressed the full assembly, speaking in simple terms that the translation computers could easily handle. He proposed a new charter for galactic civilization based on principles that humans had learned through painful experience. No species could conquer another. Any species that violated another's sovereignty would face the combined response of all member states. Technology and knowledge would be shared freely. Trade would be open and fair. Disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Some representatives were enthusiastic about the proposal. The Talvan and other recently liberated species saw it as protection against future conquest. Others were suspicious. A few species that had benefited from the old imperial system worried that they would lose their status and privileges. But even the skeptics had to admit that the old system was gone. The Galactic Council had collapsed and something needed to replace it. The debate continued for 3 days. Jake watched as representatives argued, negotiated, and slowly built consensus. It reminded him of the early days of various Earth governments, when people who had been enemies or strangers tried to figure out how to live together peacefully. It was messy and frustrating, but it was also hopeful. These species were choosing cooperation instead of just accepting whoever was strongest. On the 4th day, the Galactic Assembly Charter was signed by representatives from 63 species, including Earth. It was not perfect. There were compromises and exceptions and clauses that nobody was completely happy with. But it was a foundation, something that could be built upon and improved over time. More importantly, it was a choice. Every species that signed the charter was choosing to be part of something larger than themselves. Thrakvan approached Jake one final time before the human delegation departed. The former War Master said he had spent his entire life believing that strength came from domination and control. Jake and the humans had proven him wrong. Real strength came from knowing when to adapt, when to change, and when to admit that the old ways no longer worked. He did not know if he could learn to live in the new galaxy that humans had helped create, but he was going to try. Jake told him that the fact he was willing to try proved that anyone could change. Change was hard and often painful, but it was always possible. That was maybe the most important lesson humanity had learned from thousands of years of history. Civilizations that adapted survived. Civilizations that refused to change eventually failed. The Galactic Council had refused to change, and it had cost them everything. The human delegation boarded their ship for the journey back to Earth. Kate Sullivan was piloting, with Danny Price handling navigation and Lisa Hayes managing communications. As they prepared to enter warp, Jake looked back at the space station where the Galactic Assembly was still in session. 63 species working together to build something new. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Admiral Blake sat down next to Jake and raised a drink in an informal toast. He said humanity had come to the galactic stage late, with primitive technology and no real military power. They had faced enemies that outnumbered them 100 to 1, and somehow they had not just survived but had changed the entire political structure of the galaxy. Not bad for a bunch of primitives from a backwater planet. Jake smiled but pointed out that they had not really changed anything. They had just reminded the galaxy of lessons that should have been obvious. Empires fall. Freedom matters. Cooperation beats conquest in the long run. People throughout the galaxy had known these things on some level. Humans had just given them permission to act on that knowledge. The ship entered warp, and the stars stretched into lines of light. Jake thought about everything that had happened since the Galactic Council first threatened Earth. They had fought 2 battles without really fighting, defeated 3 empires without destroying them, and helped create a new galactic order based on cooperation instead of conquest. It was the kind of victory that would be studied by military historians for generations. But the real victory, Jake thought, was not in the battles or the tactics. It was in proving that intelligence and adaptability could overcome brute force. It was in showing that understanding history and psychology could be more powerful than any weapon. It was in demonstrating that the supposedly weak and primitive could teach the strong and advanced if the strong were willing to learn. The alien warlords had mocked human strategy because humans fought with tricks and deception instead of honor and strength. But in the end, those tricks and that deception had brought down empires that had stood for centuries. And the galaxy had learned a lesson that would not be forgotten. Never underestimate humans. Not because they were strong, but because they remembered their history and learned from their mistakes. In a universe that had forgotten those lessons, that memory made them the most dangerous species of all.